Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by Toni Walters to discuss shared reading. Hi, Toni. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm wonderful. So excited that we got to have you here, like I said, to talk about shared reading and just to chat.
Yes. I appreciate the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's start with an introduction. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay. So my name is Toni Walters. I'm an assistant professor at the University of the District of Columbia. I am also an ASHA certified speech and language pathologist, with most of my experience being with pediatric speech and language pathology clients. I've worked in private practice settings in public schools, and now, my work in higher ed at UDC is where my primary focus is on areas related to child language.
Very cool. It's funny to think about that because child psychology, I feel like, was always in my brain. Like that's something that I knew was an area of study, but I guess I just like forgot about child speech. Like it seems silly to say that.
Yeah, I think people, when we talk about child language, sometimes people don't quite understand that speech and language can be impacted in children.
Right.
That there are some children who don't know how to learn vocabulary. They really wrestle with that, or they might wrestle with how to form sentences or organize their ideas. So the child language space is one where we find ourselves explaining to lay people
Yeah.
that it's more than articulation.
Yeah, I definitely believe that.
Yes,
Very
yes,
cool work to do.
yeah.
Um, so you said you're at UDC. So if people were like looking to find you in the world, but also like online, where would they go?
Okay. So I work at the University of the District of Columbia. We have a speech and hearing clinic at UDC that actually, to make a plug, right, offers free services to um, constituents of the District of Columbia, the DMV
Oh, wow.
actually. So anybody in the area who needed services in speech and language could come to our speech and hearing clinic to access those services. The licensed speech therapists at UDC at the speech and hearing clinic supervise graduate clinicians as they
Ah, very
deliver
cool.
the services. But the services are considered by ASHA to be, the equivalent of services you would get any place else, just with the understanding that you're in a training program with graduate students.
That's very cool. I don't think I realized that was at UDC. So what a great resource, especially if you live like generally close. Or if you work in the city and can take your child up there or things like that. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We also do teletherapy, by the way.
Oh,
I know that is an option. Yes, yes.
wow.
So, but in terms of my contact information at
Yeah.
UDC, I can be found at tony.walters at udc.edu. That's my email address if people wanted to reach out to me. Um, and then I also have a LinkedIn page. I keep as my professional page, and I'm working on keeping it updated.
Aren't we all? So your LinkedIn page, and your email, I'll put in the show notes so that folks can reference that and contact you however they need to.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
Yes.
let's hop into these questions here. So shared reading. I don't know that I've necessarily heard of maybe when I hear you describe it, I'll know what shared reading is, but that is not a term that I've heard before. So let's start there. What is shared reading?
Okay. Shared reading generally happens when two people or more, sometimes there are more people involved, engage in viewing the same text while
Hmm.
one person reads the text.
Okay.
So this can occur among it can occur among a group of children, for example, between children and adults is probably how we most often see it.
Right.
And sometimes among adults, right? Sometimes two adults will be in a shared reading situation. But the goal really of shared reading is that there's this singular focus or referent, which is the book. And then
Okay.
shared reading becomes this socially positioned act where print is involved.
Okay.
Hmm.
So that makes sense, but for some reason, shared reading sounds very fancy. It's like,
It right, because it does get more complicated than that. So if
okay.
at what I described previously is really how we view it in general terms. But
Right.
for our purposes, I would like to focus on shared reading approaches that are more interactive in nature,
Hmm.
because those tend to give us more, pardon the cliche, bang for a buck, right? Um,
Right.
we know, for example, from research that children who are exposed to a greater number of words, phrases, sentences in print fare better when they go to school.
Okay. Yeah.
So the research on shared reading approaches are really being looked at insofar as how they can provide an advantage to children to
Mm.
really expand their communication and the breadth
Right.
of their experiences with print. I think that the additional point I wanted to make about shared reading is that when it's intentionally done and it's mediated by a more expert person, typically an adult,
Hmm.
um, early learners get exposure to how language works.
Right.
Um, the approach tends to be child-centered. So, for example, an adult might pick up a book that the child is familiar with, or will expose the child to a story and then move through the process of an interactional conversation with the child
Hmm.
about a book. And the particular shared reading approach that I like to use for training is dialogic reading.
Oh, dialogic reading. What is that?
So, dialogic reading is one well accepted approach to shared book reading that focuses the attention of the adult on certain principles. And those principles increase the likelihood that the adult will act more as a facilitator and provide the child with more opportunities to participate verbally in the
Okay.
reading activity.
If you were to give it like an example of dialogic reading, what would that kind of look like?
Sure. So, dialogic reading, when you will know dialogic reading is occurring when, in observing two people reading a book, a child and an adult, for example, you
Hmm.
may you may realize that some dialogic reading principles are in that space when you find that the adult is asking particular types of questions. So readingrockets.org has like a nice guideline for how a person might approach dialogic reading and the kinds of
Oh,
questions that get asked. They
okay.
they use these acronyms, right, to help us focus our attention on quality of questioning and variety of questioning. So, for
Okay.
example, on that website, there is the expression of the crowd acronym, right? So it's CROWD, where the facilitator, parent, or teacher is reminded to focus on these kinds of questions, completion questions, right? So a completion prompt usually is something like if I said up and, you might
Hmm.
finish that as down. Or in reading a book like Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, that
Mm.
the famous line, Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, will there be enough? And the child
I
might say room. I don't know if you're
true.
familiar with that
I
one.
can't, I've read it, but it's been a really long time since I've read that book. But yes, I do. I'm aware of it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So the completion prompt is one that it's real exciting and energizing for children. They get to participate as a part of the reading process, of reading the process of reading the book. The R for recall questions, right?
Okay.
So sometimes we're asking children to tell us what they remember about the
Mm,
story that was read, or about a part of the story that was read. And typically, when I work with either clinicians or teachers with regard to dialogic reading, I encourage them to open the book to a particular page, referencing
okay.
a picture, for example, or a word if the child is able to read sentences or read words. Sometimes I encourage them to point to a word or point to a phrase or a sentence and ask the child, what was happening here? Do you remember what happened in this
Hmm.
part of the story? So that's the recall prompt. The O is for open-ended questions. And
Mm,
open-ended questions, a lot of times as we read to children, we do a lot of closed questions,
right.
lots of yes, no, lots of single word responses we often ask for as adults, right? So that acronym helps to remind a facilitator, you've got to ask some open-ended questions as well. And so
Yeah.
preparing open-ended questions for the reader to respond to so that a conversation can be had around the text that's being read. So we're at the O, W, for WH questions. And
Oh, yeah.
WH questions sometimes will bring single word answers, right? Who was the story about? You know, who built the house with straws if you're talking about the three little pigs? So pig number
Right.
one built the house with straw, right?
Right.
And so it gets you a word or a phrase with WH questions. Some WH questions can also be open-ended
Hmm.
questions, right? But again, the acronym is to encourage us to reflect and think and plan so that we have a greater variety and greater quality of questions. And then the D is for distancing questions. Your distancing type questions are ones where the child is asked to make some kind of connection to their own lives or to themselves, in terms of a story like chicka chicka boom boom, all those letters fell out of the tree and hurt themselves because they were too crowded.
Hmm.
So, one distancing question could be, have you ever had an experience where you were in a place where there just was not enough room? Tell me about that, right? It opens a conversation for the child to understand that the nature of a story is greater than what's just in the text,
Right.
and that they can actually use it to extend to understanding even their own lives from listening to or reading stories with an adult. So
Wow.
that's that crowd acronym, and there are a couple of other expanded areas, but we don't, we can go into it or people can reach out and
Well, that's really cool. Yeah, I'd never heard of dialogic reading. And it, of course, like same thing with shared reading, where once you explained it to me, it made all the sense in the world. Um, and it does seem kind of like the natural thing that you want to do, like when you're reading a book or a story to a child. But it's it's nice to have, like for example, the crowd acronym that you shared, because now you can think about like what do I ask my child like to get them more to interact more with excuse me, to interact more with this story. So that is really cool. Thank you for sharing that.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So my next question for you was, where is shared reading like generally done? It sounds like from what we started talking about, it's normally in the home, but does it happen in the classroom as well?
Good question. So shared reading particularly, and I'm going to probably say this quite a bit, when shared reading is intentionally planned and it's mediated by an adult, it's interactive and involves the child as an active participant in the reading activity. It's
Mhm.
done both by a parent and in the classroom. Classroom teachers also use shared reading approaches to
Okay.
help students extend their vocabulary or better understand the content of what is being read.
Since you're saying that it's shared reading is normally one-on-one, do you see it ever happen in a group setting? I'm assuming in the classroom that would be more of a group setting because teachers don't have the time to meet with all their kids one-on-one, unfortunately. But what do you see is more widely used?
That is really a good question. Dialogic reading can actually be used with an individual. So, one adult, one child, that dyadic experience.
Right.
But it can also be used with small groups and it could be used in a classroom. Um,
Okay.
the nature of the preparation and the nature of prompting and questioning that is used with dialogic reading allows it to be flexible across all of those contexts.
Okay.
Mhm.
So in terms of shared reading, how would a teacher, as opposed to like a parent, go about implementing that shared reading in their classroom?
So if we can talk a little bit maybe about the age group.
Yeah.
So dialogic reading is usually used with preschool children. Sometimes kindergarten, first grade classrooms may have some features of the dialogic reading model in their
Okay.
shared reading contexts, but mostly for preschool. So typically in a preschool classroom, you have children sitting, maybe perhaps in a circle, and the teacher sitting with them. Preschool classrooms often have the option of a large book, for example, right? And so the teacher can hold up the large book, and as she reads, she can generate those kinds of questions, the crowd acronym questions that we referenced before. The
Yeah.
thing that a teacher, and I think essentially very similar, right? But within a classroom context, what the teacher would need to be mindful of is that she's giving enough opportunity to all the children to participate in the interactive reading space. And so, on that same Reading Rockets
Mhm.
website, they talk about how to use prompting, right? The kinds of things that facilitators should reflect on in order to ensure that they are providing kind of rich responses, rich opportunities, and rich responses to children. So, for example, there's another acronym called PEER, the PEER acronym.
Okay.
Um, and so the PEER, right? So the P being for prompt, provide the child with a prompt. Okay. And
Mhm.
your prompt can be in the form of one of those crowd questions.
Right.
Um, Evaluate the child's response. So in a classroom context, what I would picture is the teacher providing a prompt, evaluating the response of one child, and maybe having that child consider how to add to their response if their
Mm.
response was not sufficient, for, let's say, right? Because
Right.
the listener's acting as an evaluator, or perhaps asking one of the other children to support that child in providing that type of a more full response or another response, right? So she
Mhm.
could ask the question to multiple, she could present the prompt and have
Right.
multiple children respond to the prompt. So that's the kind of picture that shows up, for example, in a preschool classroom.
Right.
The teacher also would be very intentional to expand the children's responses. So for example, we know that preschool children sometimes will give you single word responses
Yeah.
or phrases, right, instead of sentences when the sentence is the expectation. So the
Right.
teacher in that context might model, right?
Okay.
She may say, for example, yes, let's say the child said, in response to the letters falling out of the tree, they fell, right? And she might
Mm.
say, who fell? And maybe the child
Right.
says the letters. And then she'll put those two pieces together and say,
Right.
yes, you're right. The letters fell out of the tree. So
Right.
that type of conversation and communication is happening in the classroom. Um, so the prompt is provided, the teacher evaluates it, the teacher may expand, and then there's a repetition of the prompt. For example, if we use that same example, the teacher may say, well, tell me again what happened here. And the child's
Okay.
response now needs to be the totality of the two pieces, right? Where the
Right.
child would say that, yes, the letters fell out of the tree, so that they have yet another opportunity to use the kind of language that was anticipated or expected in the first place. So
Right.
that might be how it looks in a classroom. You may have multiple children responding. When you do
Yeah.
it one-on-one with your child at home, it looks very similar, except now you're just in that single
Right.
parent-child context.
Yeah. So with shared reading, in terms of the frequency, is this something that you do on like a daily basis, or would you do this a couple times a week? Like how often do you recommend doing this? Um, and does that, I guess, like vary by age?
Mhm. Okay, so I love the question about frequency. I'll address that part
Yeah.
first, because what I've read and what I know about frequency, we do recommend that people read to their children on a daily
Yeah.
basis.
Okay.
How long people read to their children, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that's up for debate, because there
Okay.
really isn't any true consensus about how much reading is going to be enough reading for any individual child. With regard to the classroom setting, reading is happening every day. And so
Right.
if I were to make a recommendation, I would recommend that the dialogic reading model is used daily in
Okay.
the context of reading with the children. And I say with instead of to, because the children are supposed to be participating. They are
Right.
active participants in this process. Um, so yes, so in terms of age ranges, we're looking at preschool, we're looking at, you can read to infants, and
Yeah.
when we read to infants, what we tend to do is we take their turn for them, right? So if you're going to actually be using any kind of dialogic reading prompts or questioning, you would be asking the question and waiting for the baby to babble or use single words, and then you would say, oh, this is what I heard you say. There's this great video out of a
Cool.
father and his child.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
I know what video you're talking about. And this is the second time it's been brought up on this podcast because it's the best video. It's just
It,
the best.
it's amazing. If they
Yeah.
now they were having a conversation about something they were watching. If there
Yeah.
was a book in that, if they were talking about a book, if there was a book that the dad was reading, the conversation should be equally dynamic, right, between them. And so, um, you know, part of, I guess, part of the dialogic reading descriptions and the kinds of questions, the kinds of responses, it leans very much an older preschooler, like a 2 or 3 year old, somebody with some language. But language doesn't develop in a vacuum, right? We've got to be communicating with our infants and toddlers even before they're able to do it for themselves. So I would argue every day,
Every day.
every day.
Oh, all
Yeah,
right. That
yeah.
makes sense. And I love the like reading to infants because um my niece, I remember getting to babysit for her at one point, and she had, all the little like tiny, super thick page infant books, right? And she loved them. Like there was at one point where I couldn't get her to calm down, and I like, like talked to her mom, and I was like, what do you think she needs in this moment? And she was like, maybe read her a book. Instant, like, just instant calm.
Yeah.
And it's just really sweet to see that. Um, and it reminds me of like how important like the physical text is from such an early age, even though they cannot read it, like they still like grasp the concept of it being something that they enjoy. And so I'm glad you said, that reading to infants is also important. Like you said, language doesn't just come out of nowhere.
Right, right. Yes.
So with shared reading, Does that focus mainly on reading comprehension? We've talked about language, like what's the main goal that's happening there with the shared reading?
So researchers have actually found that there are a number of benefits
Yeah.
to shared reading, and particularly when it's interactive, right? When we
Okay.
plan it intentionally and it's interactive, or we practice using some of these prompts and cues with children.
Yeah.
And the growth areas include things like growing the vocabulary. So children
Mhm.
learn new words from listening to and reading books with an adult,
Right.
because books provide an opportunity to experience things that aren't necessarily in our everyday experience.
Right.
So vocabulary is an area of growth that happens. Social communication also grows,
Mm.
right? Because
Yeah.
children are learning reciprocity, right? And by reciprocity, I mean that when I ask a question, there's a response, and sometimes there's a particular response that's needed.
Right.
So they're learning that from that kind of interactive reading experience as well.
Right.
So when we say, does dialogic reading or shared interactive reading build comprehension? Yes, to some extent, but I think it's just so much, there's so much more that
Right.
happens than comprehension in our traditional sense. You know, traditionally when we say comprehension, people think, can a child answer the 5W questions about a story, right? And
Right.
comprehension is so much more than that. It's much more robust, it's experiential, it's connecting something that you've read to something that you've experienced, or imagining how that
Right.
experience could happen to you and what would that feel like or look like for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's just more to comprehension than meets the eye. And
Right.
when we talk about shared reading, interactive in an interactive fashion, it taps into social communication, oral language, right? Understanding the text, extending from beyond the text,
Right.
um, understanding text features. What are the things, as I think about your question too, I think to myself, in learning about just about anything, there are some conventions that we've got to know about, right? And
Yeah.
early reading exposes children to some of these conventions. There's such a thing as a book. A book has
Right.
a cover, it's got an author and an illustrator. It's got pages, pages turn, right? There are all of these little conventions, these little black and white things are represent words.
Right.
Those things sound very much like the things I hear in conversation, right? So they're mapping a lot of different bits of information from experiencing reading with an adult,
Right.
um, that goes, I would say, beyond the basics of comprehension.
Yeah. Wow. That is so crazy to think about. And this sounds really silly, but I have a Kindle as an adult, and I'm sitting here thinking like the page turning feature of, there isn't like you can't turn a page on a Kindle. It's just
Yes.
like a funny thing to think about as like technology continues to advance, and different ways of reading like come into play, right? But anyway, that was just a side note. I just thought that was like an interesting thing. I
No,
appreciate the page turning bit.
yeah, no, I love that because, that is something that is I think people are starting to consider the idea that we have all of these ways of looking at how children learn. And a lot of
Yeah.
them are based on a time when we relied on pen and paper.
Right.
Um, and I think your point is well taken that on a Kindle there is no page turning in the traditional sense, but but there are still words, and the
Yeah.
words still appear in a certain order, right? So how does the toddler or, early learner, kindergartner, first grader, how do they learn the conventions, how to
Mm.
hold it, what direction? If you flip it a particular way, will the text also move with it, right?
Right.
So there are all of these conventions that children are learning, and can they learn them all on their own? I don't know. I think
Right.
learning is a social thing. And
Yeah.
so within the social context of sharing the reading, it doesn't necessarily have to be a book, does it? It could be, like you point out, the Kindle. It could be on the computer.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Or, kids have their little like tablets, you've got your little iPad.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I still think there are conventions to learn about doing that. And I think, as I think about things like reading on an iPad or even on a Kindle, the separation between the act of turning pages and being able to turn back pages,
Oh,
it
yeah.
works a little bit differently when the page disappears, right,
Yeah.
on a Kindle or on an iPad. And how do you kids need to learn, how do you get back there if you
Right.
need it for recall, if you need it
Yeah.
to help you recall the content? um
Oh, that's funny.
yeah, yeah. So
Oh, wow. I
yeah.
didn't think about that. There's another video I saw on social media that was like someone making a joke about toddlers not understanding that kind of concept, like you said, right? Like the page disappears, but like it's still there, the content's still there.
Yeah.
And it was two toddlers like talking to each other, right? And one of them said, "My dad the other day, he put his hands above his face and he just disappeared." And I was like, I don't know if I'm ever going to see him again. I don't know. And then all of a sudden, he was back and he said, "Peekaboo."
That's pretty funny. That's a great story.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
But that is funny to think about with the Kindle. I never even, thought of that concept of that physical page isn't there anymore. It's gone. Does the child know that the content is still there? Like that's something they have to learn. That is really
Right.
interesting.
Right. Right. And
Yeah.
how to access it, because
Right.
accessing it is different depending on the device that you're
Right.
using. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to ask you. We kind of covered age, in terms of who shared reading is like mainly for, but you did mention adults. I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to expand on between like shared reading in other age groups.
So when we talk about shared reading, sometimes we think of shared reading with regard to stories, but we can use shared reading for other types of material as well. So, for example, non-narrative material.
Yeah.
There is stuff about science, for example, that children
Mm,
might be learning. And you can use the same shared reading approach, the dialogic reading in particular, to
right.
to carefully craft questions and plan for how you will interact with the child around that kind of text as well. So it works for
Right.
for different kinds of text too, not just for stories. So that's
Right.
important to add.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you said that because that's something I think even um sounds silly, but like even like middle and high schoolers could like take into thought when they're reading things on their own, right? Like being able to sit and actually like comprehend, like you said before, comprehension goes like beyond, just the basics, but um really being able to like understand the text and know like what they need to take from it and what can apply to, what they're doing in the classroom or what they're seeing in real life. Because I feel like for kids, once they get to a certain age where they need to start like writing papers or like taking things from text and putting them into other contexts, it's hard for them to remember like how they're going to get that get what they need from a piece of text, if that makes sense, right? Like, what do I ask, or what am I looking for? So that's an interesting thought.
So the frameworks for middle, upper elementary and middle school, and even high school are a bit
Mhm.
different than
Okay.
the dialogic reading. Now we're talking about things like text frames, right? Or
Okay.
sometimes it's known in the literature as text structure. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we can talk about that now, or we can talk about that on
Oh yeah.
another podcast. Um, but text structure for your upper elementary, middle, and high school, there are there are a number of them. The one of the ones that people know the best is compare and contrast, right? The
Right.
good old Venn diagram, two interlocking
Yes.
circles with a space in the middle. The
Yeah.
space on the left is for all the things that you know about, let's say an orange, if we're doing comparing two fruits.
Right.
Um, the things on the right are all the things you know about a banana. And the
Yeah.
things in the middle are the things you list in the middle are the things that an orange and a banana might have in common, right? So from that, you can generate a good old compare and contrast paragraph. And a lot of texts in upper elementary, middle, and even for younger children too, but primarily your, you know, third through fifth grade, middle
Hmm.
and high school has all of these different ways of organizing ideas.
Right.
History texts use timelines, for
Yeah.
example. Yeah. Some texts use description. So there's a description someplace, and children need to be able to understand and extract content from these different kind of text structures is,
Right.
I think, what's in the teaching literature. But
Yeah.
they're also called text frames. They need to
Yeah.
figure out what's happening as they read in order to determine what is needed, what can they extract
Right.
from the content of text when they're reading on their own. Now, do I promote the idea of reading with older children? Absolutely, because
Yeah.
I actually think it's an enjoyable experience at minimum, and learning should be enjoyable. And if we
Exactly.
want people to be learning from text, then we ought to make it enjoyable. So if it's
Right.
enjoyable to do it together, then great, we could share the experience. But I think, at that point, we're looking at some different things. Now, are we providing prompts to older children? Absolutely, we can. Are we evaluating what the children are saying? Absolutely, we are. Are we
Right.
expanding and extending? Yeah, in more sophisticated ways, right?
Right.
So, one of the expansions might be, oh, I think they're comparing two things there. What two things are being compared, and having the children answer, right? So
Right.
we can do that kind of thing with older children.
Yeah.
Um, and it moves a little bit away from that dialogic reading perspective, but
Right.
still uses um, some of the same facilitator reminders, like that PEER thing. The peer
Hmm.
reminder is really can still be useful for older children when you
Yeah.
read with them. Yeah, yeah.
And since we're talking about older kids who like we're assuming can read now, um, would you recommend that they are the person like driving the bus, kind of like they're reading the story, but the parent like still asks questions? Do you ever recommend that it kind of flips in that way?
So I'm going to say yes, and supported by there's this blog that sometimes I follow by Timothy Shanahan, and one of the things he says is yes, when children can read, they should be reading to the parents, because that's how they get the practice they need in order to be successful. And the
Right.
types of prompts that we use with children who can read may not, again, they may very much resemble the PEER framework, and
Hmm.
maybe we are giving some phonological cues if word calling is an issue, right? Or
Okay.
maybe we're giving some. semantic cues to help to build comprehension. But the
Right.
child is the question asker often, right? What does that
Oh,
word
yeah.
mean? Is
Yeah.
something that a child might say, or they may read and make a face. And when they make a face, you say to them, so, or, you made a face. What does that mean? And
Right.
allow them to say, I find this confusing. And generally with older children, when they say, I'm confused, I want to know about what specifically, because I'm confused
Right.
it's a runaway train if you leave it open-ended like that.
Right.
So yeah, so focusing the child driving the bus, absolutely leading the charge of reading the text.
Yeah.
And I know that there are struggling readers who just have a difficult time getting through, um, continuous text.
Right.
What I sometimes do is, in my own practice with children, is I'll say, you read one paragraph and I'll do the next. Or
Yeah.
you read the paragraph and then as we talk about it, I'll reread it so that we can talk about the parts.
Oh, yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So there are ways of actually getting older children the practice that they absolutely need in order to become more expert readers
Yeah.
and advance their skills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was all I have for you.
Okay.
Um, was there anything you wanted to add?
Uh, Not at the moment. I can't think of anything right now, but I do
Yeah.
want to say thank you so much for having
Oh,
me. This was
yes.
this was a growing experience for me. And I
And I
and
always learn from this, so it's always growing experience for me.
absolutely. I do hope that what we talked about and what I had to offer is helpful to someone.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
people can feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer an email or respond to a communication on LinkedIn or yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll put all of that, the ways people can contact you in the show notes so they can reach out to you. But thank you so much for being here. I definitely think that this is going to help someone because it helped me. So you can check that box.
Woohoo!
Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.